My girlfriend has a secret room at home that is always locked. When she wasn't home, I broke down the door and passed out. My girlfriend Amy and I have been together for 5 wonderful years, and we're currently planning the next big step in our relationship. Moving in together. It feels monumental. The kind of milestone that reminds you how far you've come as a couple. The plan is for me to move into her home once my lease is up, which will be in 2 months. We've discussed it extensively, and it seems like the logical next step. After all, we've grown closer with each passing year, and sharing a living space feels like the natural evolution of our relationship. Our relationship is, by all accounts, great. Sure, we have disagreements, as any couple does, but they're rare and never escalate to anything unmanageable. Whenever conflicts arise, we approach them rationally, sitting down and communicating openly until we find common ground. It's one of the reasons I love her so much. She's pragmatic, empathetic, and willing to work through problems with a level head. Amy is the proud owner of a house, a responsibility she took on nearly 10 years ago. She's always been fiercely independent and financially savvy, qualities I deeply admire. The house is a large, old Victorian with 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. It's a striking structure, with intricate woodwork and towering windows that hint at its storied past. When she bought it, the city we live in was going through a rough patch economically. Think of a situation similar to Detroit's downturn. Not exactly the same, but close. Back then, the housing market in certain neighborhoods was so depressed that you could snag a sizable home for next to nothing. That's exactly what Amy did. She took a calculated risk, buying a fixer-upper in a less than desirable area and banking on the hope that the neighborhood would eventually improve. Luckily for her, it did. Over the years, the area has transformed, and her home is now a valuable asset in an up-and-coming. Despite the house's size and charm, we usually spend most of our time at my apartment. My place is closer to Amy's job, and since I don't own a car, commuting to her home on a regular basis wasn't always practical. However, on some weekends, I'd spend the night at her house, and I always found it peaceful and inviting, a stark contrast to the bustling city noise near my apartment. That dynamic shifted about 5 months ago when my job went fully remote. With no need to be tethered to my apartment for work, I started spending more time at Amy's house. It was convenient and gave me a chance to acclimate to what living there might feel like. Her house is so much bigger than my apartment, and it felt like a mini vacation every time I stayed there. I loved the spaciousness, the quiet neighborhood, and the little details of the home that reflected Amy's personality. However, something peculiar caught my attention after about a month of staying there regularly. There's a room on the second floor with a latch and a padlock on it. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, it's a big house, and people often have rooms they don't use or that serve as storage spaces. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why use a padlock instead of a standard door lock? It felt excessive, almost as if she were deliberately ensuring no one could access it without her permission. Curiosity eventually got the better of me, and I brought it up with her. "Hey, what's with the padlocked room upstairs?" I asked casually, hoping to get an explanation that would put my mind at ease. Her response, however, was unexpectedly dismissive. "Oh, that? I don't really go in there or use it," she said with a shrug, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Her nonchalant attitude only fueled my curiosity. I mean, I get it. She's lived in that house alone for years and doesn't need to utilize every single room. But still, a padlock? It seemed extreme. I pressed her further, asking what was inside the room, and she responded with a vague, "Stuff." That was it. No elaboration, no details, just stuff. It was the kind of answer that felt designed to end the conversation, not to satisfy my curiosity. I couldn't let it go. I suggested that we open it up, thinking that maybe it could serve as a home office for me once I moved in. Her reaction was immediate and firm. No, she didn't offer an explanation, and her tone made it clear the topic was closed. From that point on, the locked room started to occupy my thoughts more and more. It wasn't about the contents, per se. I wasn't imagining treasure or anything particularly dramatic. What got to me was the sheer secrecy of it all. Why padlock the door? Why refuse to discuss it? And why act so indifferent about something that seemed, at least to me, highly unusual? I began paying closer attention during my stays at her house. Did she ever go into that room? Did she even acknowledge its existence? To my knowledge, she never went near it. The room might as well have been invisible to her. Still, the whole situation gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, something I needed to know before fully committing to moving in. Update. To recap briefly, I've been with my girlfriend, Amy, for 5 years, and we were planning on moving in together. While staying at her house, I noticed one of the rooms upstairs was padlocked, which struck me as odd. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying she didn't use the room, and refused to open it when I suggested it could be a good space for my home office. Her reluctance gnawed at me, and I posted here seeking advice. The theories in the comments ranged from a mundane storage space to something tied to her career in law enforcement. The most unsettling theory, however, was that the room might hold a traumatic secret. After days of turning it over in my mind, I decided I couldn't move in without addressing the issue direct. So one morning, when Amy got home from her night shift, I sat her down for a serious conversation. I explained that this wasn't about mistrust, but about transparency and comfort. I told her I couldn't see myself moving in without understanding what was in that room, even if it was just an empty space. I reassured her I didn't care what was in there, but I needed to know the reason behind the lock. At first, she tried to deflect. Her answers were vague, and she even tried to change the subject a few times, but I stood firm. I told her that while I respected her privacy, this was about building a life together, and this one issue was starting to feel like a barrier. I also made it clear that I wasn't asking to invade her space, but simply to understand it. That's when everything changed. Amy's demeanor shifted. She looked at me with this mix of exhaustion and vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Then, she started crying. Big, heaving sobs that left her breathless. I'd seen her tear up before, but never like this. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and all the emotions she'd been holding back came pouring out at once. It took a long time for her to calm down enough to speak. I held her hand and waited, reassuring her that she didn't have to tell me anything she wasn't ready to share. Eventually, through broken words and shaky breaths, she began to explain. When Amy was 19 years old, she bought the house. It was a bold move for someone so young, but she'd always been responsible with her finances. She had saved a substantial down payment and planned to use the rest of her savings to renovate the property. The neighborhood wasn't great, but the house was a steal, and she saw potential in it. 3 weeks after moving in, everything changed. One night, while she was in that room upstairs, someone broke into the house. She didn't go into every detail, but I could piece together enough to understand it was a horrific and traumatic experience. She was assaulted and left to deal with the aftermath entirely on her own. She didn't have the financial means to move and had no family nearby to turn to, so she stayed, fortifying the house with a security system and locking up the room where the attack had occurred. It was her way of reclaiming some sense of safety, of putting that night behind her. For her, locking that door wasn't just a physical act, it was a psychological. It was her way of compartmentalizing the trauma, of keeping it contained. The room itself, she told me, is empty. There's nothing inside but bad memory. After the assault, she cleared it out entirely and decided she would never set foot in it again. She padlocked it, not for what was in there, but for what the room represented. She couldn't bear to think about it, let alone confront it daily. As Amy told me all of this, I felt a mix of heartbreak and guilt. Heartbreak because she'd gone through something so terrible, and guilt because I'd pushed her to relive it. I told her I was sorry for pressing her, that I never wanted to cause her pain. She squeezed my hand and said it was okay. She admitted that in a way, she was relieved I knew. She hadn't told me before because she didn't want the trauma to define her or our relationship. Talking about it, while painful, felt like a release for her. Amy also explained that her experience was a big part of why she chose a career in law enforcement. She wanted to help others, to be there for people in their moments of need in ways she felt no one had been there for her. Knowing this only deepened my admiration for her strength and resilience. After our conversation, I told her I didn't need to see the room. Knowing the story behind it was enough. She smiled through her tears and thanked me for understanding. For her, the room isn't a physical space anymore. It's a symbol of a part of her life she's worked hard to overcome. It's been a week since that conversation, and things feel different now, in a good way. We've grown closer through this experience, and I feel like I understand Amy on a deeper level. Moving in together still feels like the right step, but now it's with a renewed sense of respect and empathy for her boundaries. The room will stay locked, and I'm perfectly okay with that. Thank you to everyone who shared their thoughts on my original post. Your insights helped me approach this situation with patience and compassion, and I'm grateful for that.